Sansa Stark stood upon the windswept battlements of Winterfell, the chill of the northern air kissing her cheeks with a fierce familiarity. She could hear the howling of the winter gales blowing against the ancient stones, as if the entire north whispered its secrets to her ear. The days since the wars and the chaos that befell the Seven Kingdoms had not been easy, yet those trials had tempered her spirit. She was no longer the girl who once trembled at the voice of Joffrey Baratheon or feared the cunning of Cersei Lannister. She had learned from every betrayal, every harsh truth, and every painful lesson. She had learned, too, from Peter Baelish Littlefinger, perhaps more than anyone else, though she despised admitting such a fact. That knowledge had carried her this far, and she sensed it would lead her to a future she could scarcely have imagined when she was merely a frightened child seeking songs of knights and chivalry. In the courtyard below, she watched the men spar with wooden swords, practicing the drills that her brother, no, her cousin, Jon Snow had instilled in them before he had departed south. They no longer had Robb or Ned to lead them, but the north was full of survivors, men and women both. The winter had been long and difficult, though not as bleak as it might have been had they lacked the loyalty of the bannermen who rallied to House Stark. Winterfell itself had been rebuilt to a place of modest comfort, though scars from the Ironborn occupation and Ramsay Bolton's cruelty remained etched in its walls. Yet, that battered fortress stood strong and unyielding under the mantle of the Stark direwolf. Just as Sansa stood, tall and steady, she could feel a sense of new beginnings stirring inside her, swirling like the heady rush of strong northern winds. News had traveled swiftly from the Vale. Lord Robin Arryn's health was in steep decline. The boy who had once looked upon her with wide, adoring eyes, perched upon the high seat of the Eyrie, seemed fated for an early death. The poison that lingered in his body, some whispered it was the result of generational weakness, others rumored something more sinister, had rendered him feeble. He was the last of his line, and so questions abounded over who would inherit the seat of House Arryn. For as long as she had known him, Robin had clung to her presence whenever they were together, as though he sensed the motherly care once given to him by Lisa Tully. Sansa had tried to be patient with him, to comfort him in small ways, but her focus had turned outward, onto the needs of her own ancestral home. Now, in the stillness of the eve, the Black Ravens carried the news. Robin Arryn's condition worsened. He, or rather those who guided him, had summoned Sansa to the Eyrie. She closed her eyes, recalling the distant memory of soaring mountain passes and the sky cells with their treacherous open walls. The Vale had always seemed a realm apart from the rest of Westeros, nestled behind the formidable might of the Mountains of the Moon. The Eyrie itself was a wonder, perched upon a rocky pinnacle, unreachable by any sizable force unless they braved the perilous climb or soared upon a dragon's wings. But Sansa held no illusions of dragons. The Targaryen threat was gone, the Northern and Vale armies had faced White Walkers, and the realm had seen enough war. But if there was any seat in Westeros as unassailable as Winterfell's ancient defenses, it was the Eyrie. The potential of uniting these two strongholds teased the edges of her mind, and with it came the memory of Peter Baelish's ambitions. He had once whispered of a future in which he stood at her side, forging an empire by combining the North with the Vale. She had spurned him and orchestrated his downfall, but the seed of his idea had never fully withered. When she opened her eyes, she spied the swirling snow in the air, a promise that winter's hold had not yet relinquished. She turned from the battlements and descended the cold stone steps to the great hall. The tall arches leading to Winterfell's interior beckoned her forward, their silent invitation echoing across the centuries. Torchlight glimmered over banners depicting the direwolf, reminding all who saw them that House Stark ruled here. As she walked, her mind wandered over the arrangement of power. The Manderleys had pledged their fealty. The Glovers, despite their past reluctance, had eventually bent the knee again. The Umbers, after so much tragedy, followed suit, and on it went, one house after another, returning to the fold, drawn by the reemergence of the rightful Starks. Through her endurance, cunning, and refusal to yield, Sansa had kept the North unified and was recognized as the Lady of Winterfell in all but official coronation. She was, after all, the last trueborn Stark in the North. Arya, her sister, was far away, having taken up her own path, a mystery to them all. Bran, King Bran, as he was now known, reigned over the 6 kingdoms from King's Landing, aided by counselors and lords who jockeyed for position. The North had chosen autonomy, but that arrangement was delicate. Boundaries and lines of authority still felt tenuous. Sansa was a Stark, but also a Tully by her mother's blood. The Vale carried the memory of her aunt and mother, Tully women who had once shaped events there. She reached the center of the hall, where a few knights stood in conversation with Maester Wolkan. They offered bows as she passed, expressions reflecting a deference to her leadership. She gave them a nod, then continued to her solar. The moment she stepped inside, a wave of warmth enveloped her from the small hearth burning in the corner, a small luxury she allowed herself despite the constraints on Winterfell's resources. A newly arrived raven lay perched on its stand, pecking idly at the stone. By it, a short note bearing the sigil of the falcon in flight, the moon and falcon of House Arryn. It confirmed what the previous missives had suggested, urging her in cordial but urgent tones to come to the Eyrie. She brushed her gloved fingers over the parchment, thoughtful. If she traveled to the Vale, she would not go alone. Her guard would be formidable. She was no fool. Once, she might have traveled hoping for the best, trusting the courtesy of lords and ladies. That naivete was gone. The East was home to many cunning hearts, the Vale especially. As far as the wide realm knew, Robin Arryn had no heir. His mother's sister, Catelyn Tully, had died, and her children either scattered or otherwise occupied. Yet Sansa was the only surviving child of Lysa's elder sister. That fact had not gone unnoticed. Those in the Vale who sought stability might see Sansa Stark as a direct connection to House Arryn's bloodline, and they would know of the deep bond she once shared with the region under Petyr Baelish's manipulations. Surely, some saw an opportunity to shape new alliances. Others might see her as an outsider, or a meddling northern pretender. The Vale was proud, fiercely so. But necessity could overcome pride in times of great change, and House Arryn's seat was not so easily passed to an unproven cousin or lesser branch without sparking a civil conflict. Sansa suspected that some among the Vale's lords would prefer an outsider with Tully blood, a known figure with strong alliances, to an internal quarrel among lesser claimants. A knock sounded at the door. She turned, clasping the parchment behind her back, as Brienne of Tarth stepped into the solar. Tall and imposing, with a face that was far kinder than her figure suggested, Brienne had remained at Winterfell to serve as Sansa's sworn shield, unwavering in her loyalty. She bowed her head slightly, the great height difference always reminding Sansa of the first time she had looked upon the noble warrior in King's Landing. "My lady," Brienne said gently, "is all well?" Sansa studied the note in her hand. "We are summoned to the Vale," she replied. "Robin Arryn nears death, or so these letters claim. The lords of the Vale wish to discuss matters of inheritance, and they look to me for counsel." Her eyes flicked to Brienne. "Tell me honestly, what do you make of it?" Brienne's blue eyes flickered with contemplation. "I would say that if the Vale truly seeks you as an heir, it will be a delicate matter. The Vale lords are proud, but many admired your mother and your aunt, despite all that befell them. And you have proven your skill in ruling the North. Your presence there might calm the confusion. However, I do fear a trap. Someone may seek to use the claim to lure you away from Winterfell, to separate you from your power base." Sansa nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes, that was my thought as well. Yet I cannot ignore this call. If the Vale truly seeks to name me Robin's successor, and I do nothing, I may squander an opportunity that could benefit the North as well. But I will take no rash step. I plan to gather a suitable retinue and depart, leaving the North in secure hands. We'll need good men and women. Sir Brienne, I would ask you to come with me." Brienne's nod was immediate, as though the question needn't have been asked. "Of course, my lady. I serve you." Though Sansa trusted Brienne implicitly, she knew that the Vale's cunning was not based solely on martial might. There were the Lords Declarant, men such as Lord Royce, Lady Waynwood, and others who had once tried to curtail Littlefinger's power. Sansa remembered them well. honorable in some cases but proud and set in their ways. If they believed Sansa was a puppet that could be manipulated, they would quickly learn otherwise. But she would rather not begin a confrontation before she even set foot in the Vale. Carefully, methodically, she resolved to approach the matter with all the calm and composure she had learned in King's Landing. If the Vale wanted her, they would have to accept her on her own terms. She penned a reply that same evening, indicating her willingness to travel to the Eyrie at once. She wrote with polite courtesy, her words subtly reminding them of the loyalty that once bound the Vale to the north. Her father's memory still lingered there, as did the respect for House Tully. Satisfied, she sealed the letter with the direwolf sigil and gave it to a messenger. Then she called for her steward to begin preparations for a journey. A carefully chosen band of knights, several trusted northern lords, and enough supplies to see them safely through the treacherous passes of the Mountains of the Moon. Word spread swiftly throughout Winterfell that its lady would soon depart. The household bustled with activity, and in the crisp morning air, the courtyard rang with the sounds of horses being shoed and men shouting instructions. Sansa oversaw the planning, determined that they would travel not with the pomp of conquerors, but with the dignity of proud Starks. That meant fewer wagons, no gaudy banners, just enough resources to show they were not beggars. She wished the impression to be that of resolute readiness, a demonstration that she did not come begging for an inheritance but was prepared to claim it if it was indeed her due. Within a few days, the column of riders and carriages formed in the courtyard. Snow still dusted the ground, and the cold winds promised a challenging journey, but Sansa was well accustomed to the rigors of travel in the north. Clad in a heavy cloak trimmed with white fur, she emerged from the great hall one morning, accompanied by Brienne, who bore her sword faithfully at her side. The men paused to bow or salute as Sansa passed, and she acknowledged them with measured grace. She saw in their eyes the same trust and loyalty that had grown since she returned to Winterfell. Once, she had been the delicate daughter of Lord Eddard Stark, overshadowed by the martial prowess of her siblings. Now, she commanded the respect of grizzled veterans and proud nobles alike, her leadership proven through the crucible of war and survival. When all was in readiness, she mounted her horse, a fine gray mare. With a final glance at Winterfell's walls, she gave the signal, and the party began its trek down the King's Road and eventually across the cold plains that led eastward toward the Vale. They kept a wary eye on the weather. Snow still fell intermittently, veiling the world in white. Yet the roads, while partially frozen, were passable. They encountered few travelers, and those they did were fleeing the troubles of uncertain times, anxious to find some measure of safety behind strong walls. For nights on end, the party made camp in carefully chosen spots where watchfires could be maintained, and scouts patrolled the perimeter. Sansa never forgot the lessons learned in the War of the Five Kings and the battles afterward. Vigilance was key. One moment of carelessness could mean disaster. Brienne rode close to Sansa each day, watching for any sign of threat, but the roads to the Vale were surprisingly quiet. Perhaps the repeated wars had culled bandits, or the cold had driven them to hide. Whatever the reason, the journey moved at a steady pace, and soon the looming peaks of the Mountains of the Moon came into view, their majestic forms rising against the sky like silent sentinels. They would have to ascend the perilous passes, past the Bloody Gate, and then make their way to the Gates of the Moon, the castle that stood below the Eyrie. From there, they would scale the twisting mountain path to the high seat of House Arryn. Memories of her last journey through these lands, when Littlefinger had guided her under the guise of a lane stone, flooded her mind. She recalled how he had insisted she dye her hair, alter her demeanor, conceal her identity. She remembered how the Vale lords had mistrusted him and how her Aunt Lisa, mad with jealousy and fear, had turned on her in that precarious stronghold, only to plunge through the moon door to her death by Peter's hand. But Sansa also remembered the beauty of the Vale, with its soaring summits and pristine waterfalls, the crisp mountain air that seemed to wash away the politics of King's Landing. What a difference a few years could make. Now, she returned as Sansa Stark, not some invented bastard girl. She came with an escort as a leader in her own right, determined to see whether the Vale truly belonged in her hands. The first sign that her arrival was expected came at the Bloody Gate, an ancient fortification built between two mountains, controlling passage into the Vale proper. A small garrison of knights in shining steel awaited, their banners displaying the falcon and moon sigil. At their head was a stout man with graying hair and a brusque manner, Lord Yon Royce. He greeted them with wary courtesy, his posture stiff in the cold air. Sansa recalled that Lord Royce had been among those who distrusted Petyr Baelish's manipulations. He had also shown Sansa a measure of respect when she was in the Vale years ago. He bowed in greeting. "Lady Sansa Stark," he said in a voice echoing off the granite walls of the pass. "The Vale welcomes you. We received word of your impending arrival. We are to escort you to the gates of the moon, where you may rest before ascending to the Eyrie. The mountain path is not an easy climb, especially in these winter conditions." Sansa inclined her head. "I thank you, Lord Royce. My men and I are grateful for the escort. The journey has been long, but we come with the best intentions. How fares Lord Robin?" Lord Royce's expression tightened, though he tried to hide it. "He fares poorly, I fear. The maester tells me his condition has worsened, and the young lord is confined to his bed. He speaks rarely, and even then in barely coherent fragments. He has asked for you by name, Lady Sansa, though I cannot say how aware he truly is of his surroundings." Sorrow flickered over Sansa's features. In truth, while she had never been close to Robin in a sisterly sense, she felt a certain pity for the sickly boy. She recalled his childlike desires, breast milk far past the age of infancy, the screeching tantrums, his coddled existence. None of that was truly his fault. He was a product of Lysa's overprotectiveness and Petyr's manipulations. "Then I shall see him as soon as possible," she said quietly. "Lead the way, my lord." The party continued forward, passing through the bloody gate without incident. The Vale stretched out before them, a place of stark, dramatic beauty. Snow covered the high peaks, and the narrow valleys glistened under the faint winter sun. They made their way to the gates of the moon, a castle nestled at the foot of the mountain that served as a waypoint before the winding climb to the Eyrie. Here, Sansa's retinue was met by more knights and a host of servants who helped them stable their horses and find rooms for the night. Lord Royce insisted that Sansa join him and a few other Vale lords for supper in the main hall, a chance to discuss the days to come. That evening, in the great hall of the Gates of the Moon, a modest feast was laid out. Though the Vale had faced lean times, they still provided fresh venison, thick stews, and mulled wine. Sansa entered, accompanied by Brienne and several of her northern advisors, including Lord Wyman Manderly's son, who had become one of her key voices in matters of diplomacy. The Vale's leading figures awaited them. Lady Anya Waynwood, an elderly but sharp-eyed woman whose house was among the oldest and proudest in the Vale. Ser Lyn Corbray, whose reputation for recklessness and skill with a sword was well known. Lord Gilwood Hunter and a few other knights of lesser station. At the high table sat Lord Royce, presiding like a caretaker of the Vale's interests. Sansa took her place, and after polite courtesies were exchanged, the meal commenced. The conversation was carefully navigated politeness, each participant testing the waters. Lady Waynwood inquired about the north, praising Sansa for having restored Winterfell. Ser Lyn Corbray offered a flippant remark about how dull the Vale had been since Petyr Baelish's downfall, but Sansa did not rise to the bait. Instead, she commented calmly on how the Vale had always been known for its peace and stability, hoping to steer the conversation away from Baelish's memory. But eventually, the subject that drew them all together arose: Lord Robin's impending passing. Lord Royce cleared his throat, and the table fell silent. "My Lady Sansa," he began in a solemn tone, "we have asked you here because Lord Robin, in his frailty, has spoken your name. He has not formally named you his heir. We are not even certain he fully comprehends the situation. But rumors and hopes run wild across the Vale. Should the boy pass without naming an heir, we face a crisis of succession. There are distant cousins with tenuous claims, but no one is recognized as strongly as you." Sansa listened, noting how his words seemed carefully measured. He avoided stating outright that the Vale lords wanted her to claim the seat, but the implication was clear. If no legitimate heir existed, They would be forced to choose someone or risk a bloody power struggle among lesser houses. Sansa represented a link to House Tully, the older sibling branch to Lisa, and she carried the prestige of the North. Moreover, the Vale lords were aware that she had governed effectively in Winterfell. Even so, she knew some of them might be wary of giving the Eyrie to a northern ruler. She inclined her head, choosing her words. "I am honored by the Vale's trust," she said. "I knew Robin as a child, though we have been apart these last years. My mother was his aunt. Should he wish to name me, I would see that his will is respected. I do not seek to supplant him prematurely, of course." Ser Lyn Corbray's voice cut in. "Not prematurely, no," he echoed, swirling his wine cup. "But time marches on, my lady. We cannot wait forever. The Vale must have leadership. Lord Robin's weakness has led to disarray. Already, travelers and small folk complain of bandits in the mountain passes. A strong hand is needed, and soon." "Yes, that is so," Lady Waynwood put in quietly, her thin fingers resting on the table. "We value the stability you might bring. Yet you will understand that some question whether your claim is strictly legal, as you descend from the female line. We are not opposed to it, only that we must be thorough. The Vale's laws are ancient." Sansa nodded. "I understand fully. My advisors and I have studied the genealogies. The Arryn line is old, and I know that typically inheritance follows male primogeniture. But I have Tully blood, and the Tullys were always close kin to the Arryns. My father's marriage to my mother bound House Stark to House Tully, and House Tully was tied to House Arryn through Lisa. In the absence of a direct Arryn male, it would seem only logical that the Vale lords decide upon a successor who can best uphold House Arryn's interests. Yes." A ripple of murmurs spread among the lords. Some nodded in agreement. Others exchanged guarded looks. Lord Royce's brow furrowed in thought. "Quite so," he agreed. "In truth, many of us see you as the best candidate. There may be those who speak of trifling cousins, but none hold the same prestige or the same potential for ensuring the Vale's security. Our knights remember how you stood up to Peter Baelish in the Eyrie. You are not wholly an outsider." Brienne, standing behind Sansa's seat, watched the proceedings silently, ever on guard. Sansa felt a flicker of relief that this introduction to the Vale's power players went as calmly as it did. She had expected more opposition. That some welcomed her openly suggested that the Vale truly yearned for strong leadership. Uniting with the North might prove beneficial to them. Trade routes, mutual defense, and the prestige of being allied with House Stark. If she played her cards correctly, the Vale could become her staunchest ally, perhaps even a territory under her rightful rule, though she had to be careful not to appear grasping. Caution was paramount. When the meal ended, Sansa retired early, citing the need to prepare for the climb to the Eyrie in the morning. Her retinue settled into the quarters assigned to them, while she and Brienne took a smaller adjoining set of rooms. The flicker of the hearth cast dancing shadows on the rough stone walls as Sansa removed her heavy fur cloak and sat by the fire to reflect. She was keenly aware that her next steps would be crucial. Claiming the Eyrie, if that was indeed the path she chose, would reshape the political landscape of Westeros. The North had declared itself free and named her queen in the North after the war's end, though the title was somewhat informal with King Bran's acquiescence. If she became Lady of the Vale as well, she would effectively rule two distinct regions, an empire of sorts, though she would never call it that aloud just yet. 2 of the 7 kingdoms combined under a Stark's rule. She wondered how King Bran would view such a development, or how the other lords of Westeros might respond. War-weary as they were, they might see it as a new threat. Yet Sansa saw opportunity, stability, strength. House Stark had always been about protecting its people. With the Vale at her side, the North would be more secure than it had ever been. The next morning, a thin light greeted them through the frost-laden windows. Sansa and her companions rose early, preparing for the arduous climb to the Eyrie. The narrow mountain trail was barely wide enough for mules, and many of her men would have to remain at the gates of the moon, coming up in small groups or waiting below. Only a select few, including Brienne and the guard Sansa trusted most, would accompany her. Thus, they set off, leaving behind the majority of their supplies and a number of knights. As they ascended the rocky path, the air grew crisper. Icy winds buffeted them, threatening to send loose stones tumbling down the steep slopes. They passed watchtowers and small guard posts, greeted by the Vale men who recognized Sansa's party. At each bend, the ground fell away beneath them, revealing breathtaking views of snow-capped mountains and sheer cliffs. Sansa remembered the awe she felt the first time she made this journey, how the Eyrie had seemed like a palace in the clouds, removed from the petty intrigues of the rest of Westeros. Now, ironically, she had come to make her own claim of leadership, a move that was anything but removed from politics. At length, the gleaming white walls of the Eyrie came into sight, its towers perched on the crest of a mountain spur, defying the very laws of nature. The gates were opened to Sansa, and she was ushered in by knights of the Vale, their armor catching the thin sunlight. She dismounted unsteadily, feeling the chill in her bones from the long climb, and gazed up at the familiar courtyard. Memories swirled. She had once trod here as Elaine Stone, keeping her true identity a secret for fear of Cersei's wrath. Her aunt had confronted her in these halls, shrieking accusations of seduction and betrayal. The moon door yawned in her mind's eye, a direct path to the deadly drop beyond. Now everything felt different. She was Lady Sansa Stark, unmasked and in command of her fate. Servants led her into the grand halls, where the floors and walls shone with pale marble. The high ceilings arched overhead like the vault of the sky, and the atmosphere was eerily serene, a hush that felt more like a place of worship than a fortress. The steward of the Eyrie, a skinny man with a severe nose, stepped forward to inform Sansa that Lord Robin had been moved from his usual chambers to one warmer and more easily accessed, as his illness prevented him from climbing the many stairs of the Eyrie. She asked to see him at once. They led her down a wide corridor, past windows that looked out over the Vale. The sharp wind hissed through every gap, and occasionally, she glimpsed the sky cells perched precariously on the castle's outer walls, frightening reminders of the Eyrie's unique brand of imprisonment. Finally, they came to a large door guarded by 2 knights. The steward opened it and beckoned Sansa inside. Robin Arryn lay upon a bed draped in furs, the color drained from his face. His breathing labored. A heavy winter cloak was piled atop him, and his frail body seemed lost in the bedding. His hair, once a mop of dark curls, had thinned and dulled. His eyes, once wide and somewhat vacant, now stared listlessly at the ceiling. A maester stood nearby, checking his pulse. The smell of sickness hung in the air, a mixture of sour sweat and the faint metallic tang of medicine. Sansa approached, her footsteps careful, each echo sounding too loud in the quiet chamber. She knelt beside the bed. When the young lord, noticed her presence, he turned his head slightly. A flicker of recognition passed over his features, though it was faint. His lips parted, and he tried to speak, but only a soft rasp emerged. She leaned closer, listening. "Sansa," he croaked. His voice was barely audible. You came." "Yes," she said, reaching out to gently place her hand over his. "I'm here, Robin. I came as soon as I heard you were unwell." He managed a weak smile, but even that seemed to exhaust him. "You always cared," he mumbled. His eyes fluttered shut for a moment, as though the effort of speaking was too much. "Mother, gone. Everyone gone." Sansa squeezed his hand gently. She recalled Lisa Tully's madness, how the woman had indulged the boy's every whim. He had grown without boundaries, without the strength that a father or balanced mother might have given him. Now he lay at the edge of life, a lonely, broken figure. A pang of empathy tugged at Sansa's heart. "I'm here," she said softly. "You're not alone." The maester, seeing that Robin was too weak to converse further, stepped forward. "My lady," he said quietly, "Lord Robin's condition deteriorates by the day. He has had fevers, coughing fits. His heart is weak. I have done what I can to ease his suffering, but there is little more I can do." Sansa looked at him. "When do you expect?" He hesitated. "I cannot say with certainty. but I fear it may be a matter of days, perhaps a week. He has clung to life longer than I thought possible, though. She bowed her head, sadness mingling with the gravity of the moment. Robin Arryn had been the rightful lord of the Vale, but he was a child still, emotionally stunted by his upbringing, physically frail from the start. Now, all the burdens of the Vale's future seemed to fall on Sansa. Carefully, she rose, letting Robin rest. She instructed the maester to tend to him with utmost care, and the man bowed. Sansa turned to Brienne, who waited near the doorway, her expression solemn. "It seems there's not much time," Sansa murmured. "We must be ready." Brienne nodded. "The Vale lords have already gathered. They will want to hear from you soon." Sansa pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "Then I must speak with them." She paused, looking back at Robin's still form. "I wanted to see him first, though. He deserved that much." Leaving the sick room, Sansa allowed the steward to guide her through the Eyrie halls to a chamber where the Vale lords had assembled. The room was modest by the Eyrie standards, with a handful of chairs arranged around a simple table. Lord Royce was there, as was Lady Waynwood and several other prominent figures. The tension in the air was palpable. They all knew that time was short, and a decision loomed. Sansa took her seat, Brienne standing behind her like a silent sentinel. Lord Royce began with a grave expression. "My lady, I trust you have seen Lord Robin?" "I have," she replied, keeping her tone even, though emotion still coursed through her from the visit. "He is gravely ill. It pains me to see him thus." Lady Waynwood nodded slowly. "As it pains us all. Yet we cannot ignore that the Vale needs a new leader. It is not beyond the realm of possibility that Robin might recover, but the maester does not seem hopeful. Should the worst happen, we must be prepared to name an heir before vultures begin circling." A murmur of agreement passed through the gathering. Sansa clasped her hands in her lap. "I understand, and I do not wish to cause undue conflict. My claim is not meant to overshadow the Vale's customs, but I am of the blood of House Arryn through my mother. Should you decide that I am best suited to succeed Robin, I will accept the responsibility with gratitude and respect for the Vale's traditions. However," she added, letting her gaze sweep over the lords, "I will not be a puppet for any who think to manipulate me. The Eyrie is not a prize to be bartered. If I become Lady of the Eyrie, it will be with the same independence and authority I hold in the north." Her words hung in the frigid air. Lord Royce pursed his lips, looking somewhat uncomfortable, but he inclined his head. "We do not seek to make you a puppet, yet we must ensure that the Vale retains its identity. If you were to bring the Vale under the rule of the North, many would resist." Sansa took a breath. "I do not propose subjugation. The Vale would remain a distinct region with its own customs, but united under my leadership, forming a closer alliance with the North. We share a border, after all, and we have a common heritage through the Tully line. If I hold Winterfell and the Eyrie both, it does not mean the Vale ceases to exist as its own region. But it does mean we would share resources, defenses, and a single guiding vision for the future." Lady Waynwood tapped her fingers on the table, considering the argument. "There are advantages," she murmured. "Trade with White Harbor, combined forces against any threat, a more unified presence in the east of Westeros." Lord Gilwood Hunter cleared his throat. "But would that not also make you the most powerful lord or lady in the realm, my lady? Perhaps even more powerful than the Iron Throne, if the North and Vale are combined." Sansa did not flinch at the question. "I seek not to threaten King Bran or the Iron Throne. I merely wish to protect my people, and if I become Lady of the Eyrie, that includes the people of the Vale. We all remember the wars, the devastation. We have no desire for more bloodshed, but a strong alliance can prevent it." The lords exchanged glances. Some seemed cautiously intrigued. Others remained wary. None openly opposed her yet, which was telling. In a realm scarred by chaos, a unifying figure who carried moral authority could be a comfort. For all their pride, the Vale lords recognized the benefit of a stable transition. Sansa also suspected that more than one of them preferred her to the potential chaos that would ensue if a lesser cousin of the Arryns tried to take power, sparking feuds and battles for legitimacy. They discussed the matter at length, voices rising and falling in the cold chamber. The possibility of formalizing an arrangement with the North was brought up. Talks of trade routes, taxation, the distribution of knights and men-at-arms all came to the fore. Sansa maintained a calm demeanor, drawing on the lessons she had learned from observing Cersei's manipulations, Marjorie's charm, and her own mother's negotiation skills. She would not promise everything, but she conceded enough points to show she was flexible. A key issue was that the Vale's highborn families insisted they would never bend the knee to a northern queen in the sense of being in occupied territory. Sansa assured them it would not be so. Instead, they would remain the Vale, with her as their Lady Paramount, just as she was Lady Paramount of the North. A union of equals, as she styled it. Of course, in practice, she would wield enormous influence, but it was essential to maintain appearances and respect traditions. By the day's end, they reached a tentative understanding. If Robin Arryn passed without a clear heir named, the assembled Vale lords would support Sansa's claim, granting her the seat of the Eyrie. In return, Sansa would confirm their rights and privileges, respect the ancient laws of the Vale, and work toward stronger ties between the Vale and the North. They would finalize this arrangement after Robin's fate was sealed, and in the meantime, they would wait and pray for his recovery. Lord Royce, Lady Waynwood, and the others all seemed relieved to have at least the outline of a plan in place. Night fell upon the Eyrie, the wind keening around its towers, and Sansa found herself alone in the solar that had once belonged to her Aunt Lysa. A single brazier provided scant warmth, and the memory of Lysa's final moments. Her screams, the open moon door, gnawed at Sansa's mind. She rose and walked to that very door, though it was currently shut, its heavy wooden panels barring the gaping drop beyond. She recalled how her aunt had nearly hurled her to her death, deranged with jealousy. And then Peter had intervened, pushing Lysa herself through the open door. That was the day Sansa realized truly how dangerous Peter was, how capable of murder. Yet that day also planted in her a new sense of self-reliance, for she had learned to play her part to expose him eventually. Now the moon door remained closed, but the memory of that mortal danger refused to be banished. She exhaled, letting the cold air fill her lungs, and tried to push away the past. She was no longer the naive girl from King's Landing. She was Sansa Stark, Lady of Winterfell, potentially the future Lady of the Eyrie. And if events transpired as the Maester predicted, that future was all but certain. At dawn the next day, the hush that fell over the Eyrie's corridors told Sansa everything she needed to know. Word had spread that Robin's condition had taken a turn for the worse in the night. She dressed quickly, not bothering with the more elaborate attire, and hurried to his chamber. The stoic knights stationed outside allowed her entry, and she saw the Maester leaning over the young lord, who lay deathly still. Lord Royce stood near the bed, silent, his thick arms folded. Robin's eyes fluttered open when he sensed someone approach. He tried to speak, but nothing coherent emerged. Sansa knelt beside him again, taking his thin hand. She felt the fragile bones beneath the skin, the chill of his flesh. His breath rattled in his chest. A part of Sansa wished she could do something to ease his pain, but she was no Maester. She could only offer comfort in his last moments. She squeezed his hand gently, recalling how innocent he had once seemed, how he had looked at her as if she were some comforting presence in a life that had offered him little real stability. She thought to speak words of comfort, but all that came out was a quiet hush, a gentle lullaby she vaguely remembered from her childhood. Robin's lips parted, as if listening, and then he let out a long, shallow exhale. His chest did not rise again. The rattle ceased, and an eerie stillness filled the room. The Maester bowed his head, gently shutting Robin's eyes. Lord Royce exhaled a breath, his face somber. Sansa rose slowly, her hand trembling just a bit. A swirl of conflicting emotions filled her. Sorrow, pity, and an undeniable sense of the shift that had just occurred. Robin Arryn was gone, the last of his direct line. That meant the Vale had no immediate lord. That meant, by the arrangement reached in the meeting the day before, she was the favored candidate to succeed him. For a moment, she allowed herself to grieve the boy who never truly had a chance. Then, as the maester covered Robin's face with a cloth, she steeled herself, knowing that the next few hours would determine if the Vale truly embraced her or if the situation would devolve into chaos. Lord Royce turned to her. "I am sorry, Lady Sansa," he said with genuine sympathy. "The boy is at peace now. We must arrange the funeral rites." "Yes," Sansa said softly. "We must. I would see the Eyrie pay him the respects he is due. Then, the matter of succession must be addressed. I will not press that issue before he is honored." The older man nodded. "Indeed, we shall do so swiftly. The Vale will look to you for guidance, my lady." She took a moment to gaze at Robin's still form. Then, with Brienne and a few knights, she left the chamber and began to walk through the labyrinthine corridors of the Eyrie. The entire castle seemed hushed with mourning, though the people also sensed the significance of this moment. Before mid-morning, the bells tolled, announcing that Lord Robin had passed. Servants hurried to prepare his body for a simple ceremony, placing him in the small sept that was carved into the side of the castle. Snow drifted through the high windows, and the cold stone floors echoed with the footsteps of knights and lords arriving to pay their last respects. Sansa stood beside the marble bier, her face solemn, a black fur stole around her shoulders. One by one, the Vale lords knelt, kissed Robin's cold hand, and offered a prayer to the Seven for the repose of his soul. Sansa offered her own prayer, though her faith had been tested many times. She prayed for peace, for the boy, for herself, for the Vale. By early afternoon, the ceremony concluded. The final step, according to tradition, was to bear the body of the Lord of the Eyrie beyond the Mountains of the Moon to be interred in the Vale's ancestral resting place. That journey would be planned soon enough. For now, the lords and ladies congregated in the Eyrie's great hall, where a subdued meal was offered. After the meal, they rose to address the quest. Ion that lingered in every mind. Who would rule the Vale now? Sansa stood at the front of the hall, near the dais where the high seat of House Arryn stood, an austere throne of pale stone, carved centuries ago. The lords gathered, forming a semicircle around her, their breaths visible in the cold air. This was the moment she had quietly prepared for. Lady Waynwood stepped forward first. "We have lost our young lord," she said, her voice carrying throughout the chamber. "Now we must choose his successor, by blood and by Robin's final requests, spoken in his delirium but clear nonetheless. He wished Sansa Stark to be by his side. We, the lords of the Vale, have seen the sense in this. Is there any here who would challenge Lady Sansa's claim to the Eyrie?" A hush fell. Sansa scanned the crowd, aware that some might protest. Yet none spoke. Lord Royce glanced around, as if inviting dissent, but received only lowered eyes or silent nods. So it was decided, or at least uncontested. He then stepped forward, cleared his throat, and said, "Then, Lady Sansa Stark, we of the Vale recognize you as the heir to House Arryn, by virtue of your maternal bloodline and the expressed wishes of our departed lord. Will you take the seat of the Eyrie and guide us, as befits the Lady of the Vale?" Sansa inhaled slowly, feeling the collective gaze of 100 lords and knights. Her heart thundered, but outwardly she remained composed. "I will," she said, her voice carrying a firmness learned through countless trials. "I swear to uphold the laws and traditions of the Vale, to protect its people, and to honor the memory of House Arryn." A ripple of relief seemed to pass through the assembled. Lord Royce lowered himself to one knee, bowing his head. Lady Waynwood, though old and stiff, followed suit. Then, like a wave, every other lord, knight, and retainer in the hall knelt, acknowledging Sansa as their new liege. She stood upon the dais, unaccustomed to having so many venerable men and women bowing before her. It was a heady sensation, powerful, and yet laced with the weight of great responsibility. She resisted the urge to glance at Brienne for reassurance, choosing instead to stand tall, letting them see she was worthy of the role they bestowed. "Rise," she said after a moment, a slight tremor in her voice. "Let there be no division between us. We face the winter together and, after that, the future. I will not fail you. In the days ahead, we will determine how best to honor Robin's memory and ensure the Vale prospers. We shall renew our ties with the North, forging an alliance that keeps us strong." They rose, and after a pause, they approached one by one to offer their oaths of fealty or words of congratulation. Sansa accepted each gracefully, mindful that these alliances rested on mutual trust, and that she would need to win them over not just by words, but by actions. Even Ser Lyn Corbray approached and, with a wry smile, pledged his sword to her service. Sansa thanked him, recalling his reputation for shifting loyalties, and made a mental note to watch him closely. When the formalities concluded, the hall slowly emptied. Some lingered to discuss matters among themselves, presumably adjusting to the reality that they now owed fealty to a Stark. Sansa found a moment to catch her breath, turning to Brienne. The tall knight bowed her head slightly, a rare smile touching her lips. "Congratulations, my lady," Brienne said quietly. "You have done what many thought impossible." "Thank you," Sansa replied, exhaling. "But the real challenge lies ahead. This is not a simple matter of taking a seat. I must rule wisely. The Vale is proud and prickly about its independence. And what of the North? The arrangement was that I remain their liege as well. If the lords of the North accept this new position, we will be strong. If they fear I'm abandoning them or dividing my loyalties, trouble could brew." Brienne's expression grew serious. "They will see the advantage in this, my lady. You have proven yourself to them. And if any doubt arises, you have steadfast allies." Sansa nodded. "I hope so, and I do have to consider King Bran's perspective. The North declared independence, but if I now hold the Vale as well, will that draw the Iron Throne's attention? Bran might accept it, he is my brother after all. But his council might not. Regardless, I do not intend to bend the knee to King's Landing. The Vale has sworn fealty to me, the North has sworn fealty to me, and I will see that arrangement respected." Her voice carried a certain steel that surprised even her. She caught sight of the stone seat of House Arryn, the seat that was now hers. A surge of memory made her recall Littlefinger's smug expression when he had once sat there. He had dreamed of controlling the North and the Vale. Now, ironically, Sansa had achieved a version of that dream without him. She stood where he had stood, but she felt no satisfaction at adopting his ambition. Rather, she felt only the burdens of responsibility. Power was not for games. It was for the protection and betterment of those under her care. If Peter Baelish had ever understood that, he had lost sight of it in his quest to climb ever higher. Over the next few days, formal announcements were dispatched throughout the Vale, informing every castle, town, and hamlet that Sansa Stark, cousin to the late Lord Robin Arryn, had succeeded him as Lady of the Eyrie. The lords who had stayed behind to witness the momentous occasion departed to their own seats, ready to relay the news to their bannermen. Meanwhile, Sansa established her presence in the Eyrie, reviewing household accounts, consulting with the steward, and speaking with the maester about the region's pressing concerns. She quickly found that the Vale, though spared much of the direct devastation of war, had its own share of troubles. Bandits in the mountains, trade disruptions caused by the harsh winter, tensions with neighboring clans. These were problems that required immediate attention, lest they grow unchecked. Sansa also wrote letters to the North, addressing them to the major houses, Manderley, Glover, Serwyn, Mormont, and others, explaining her new role and assuring them of her continued devotion to the North's welfare. She painted the arrangement as a mutually beneficial alliance, emphasizing that Winterfell and the Eyries' shared leadership under her would bring prosperity and security. She ended each letter with a personal note, reminding them of their shared struggles in the recent wars. Then she wrote one to King Bran, couched in the most respectful terms, informing him of the developments. She did not ask his permission. She merely stated what had transpired, but she assured him that the North and the Vale had no intention of clashing with the Crown, as long as the Crown respected their autonomy. For good measure, she also directed a letter to Tyrion Lannister, who served as Hand of the King, addressing him in polite but clear language, hoping to forestall any attempts by the Iron Throne to meddle. By the time a fortnight had passed, the Eyrie was bustling with renewed energy. Sansa had begun reorganizing the household, installing some of her most trusted northern men and women in key positions, while retaining those Vale servants who seemed competent and loyal. Lord Royce acted as a powerful ally, advising her on local customs and traditions. Lady Waynwood occasionally visited, offering the wisdom that came from her long years of managing a major house. Sansa studied the intricacies of Vale law with the castle maester late into the night, determined to master every detail and avoid missteps. Part of her mind, though, kept circling back to the bigger picture. She was now the Lady of Winterfell and the Lady of the Eyrie, two of Westeros's greatest strongholds. Though she was reluctant to style herself a queen, there was no denying that her domain spanned a considerable portion of the continent. The strategic implications were vast. The Vale's knights were some of the finest in the realm, while the North's forces were hardy and numerous. If she managed to fuse these armies under a single command structure, she would hold an imposing military. Economically, the Vale's fertile valleys and the North's access to vital ports like White Harbor could create a robust trading network. A sense of unity would allow both regions to flourish, provided she navigated potential rivalries. Little by little, the idea of a northern Vale empire, as some whispered it, seemed less like a fantasy and more like a practical reality. News came from the north that many houses supported her move, though some harbored doubts or simply awaited tangible benefits before showing enthusiasm. Meanwhile, letters from King's Landing were polite but guarded. Tyrion wrote that King Bran recognized the Vale's choice, and as the Vale was traditionally part of the Seven Kingdoms, he hoped that Sansa would reaffirm fealty. She responded with carefully crafted language. The Vale recognized her authority, and she recognized the Crown's interest in peace, yet she maintained that the Vale stood alongside the North in self-determination. For the moment, it seemed neither side wished to provoke open conflict, so they remained at an impasse. Winter pressed on. Snow piled against the Eyrie's walls, but the airy design of the castle minimized accumulation in the courtyards. Food stores ran low, prompting Sansa to oversee the rationing. She sent messages to the Vale's lesser houses, urging them to do the same, offering logistical support where needed. In some places, rebellious mountain clans caused trouble, stealing supplies meant for the Eyrie. Sansa dispatched loyal knights to quell them, showing mercy to those who surrendered and punishing those who remained intractably hostile. Gradually, stability reasserted itself. The people of the Vale began to see Sansa as not just a figurehead but a true leader who cared for their welfare. As the months wore on, Sansa found herself traveling between the Vale and Winterfell. She spent enough time in Winterfell to assure the northern lords that her seat of power there was not neglected, that she remained committed to the region. She saw that Winterfell's defenses were in good order, the harvests managed properly in the south of the north, and the outer strongholds well manned. She then returned to the Eyrie to address Vale concerns, forging a pattern of governance that spanned two great castles. Though the road between them was long, she found that delegating some responsibilities to competent subordinates allowed her to manage both realms effectively. In Winterfell, some whispered that she was building an empire that might overshadow any ruler in King's Landing. Others wondered if she would eventually declare herself queen in the north and the Vale, a formidable monarch in her own right. She did not publicly declare such intentions. She was cautious, well aware that too bold a proclamation could spark unnecessary wars. Instead, she let her actions speak. She settled disputes among lords, protected trade caravans, and ensured that justice was served in matters of law. Her reputation for fairness and resolve spread. Where once men spoke of a fragile maiden, now they spoke of the Lady of the North and the Eyrie, steel-willed and incorruptible. Whispers drifted south, carried by merchants and messengers. In King's Landing, the small council debated how to handle Sansa Stark's growing power. Reports suggested that some courtiers feared she might be a threat to King Bran's rule, though none dared speak openly against the young king's own sister. Others, more pragmatic, saw Sansa's influence as a stabilizing force in war-torn Westeros and urged cooperation. The Iron Throne was too fragile to pick a fight, especially with the realm still healing. Many small folk recalled how the Vale's knights, at Sansa's request, had aided in the Battle of the Bastards, and how the North had stood against the horrors beyond the wall. Was this not a fair reward for those who had sacrificed so much? The months turned into a year, and still winter did not relent. Supplies grew scarce. Sansa had to make hard choices about distribution and rationing, balancing the demands of the Vale and the North. Tension flared when shipments of grain from the Vale to Winterfell were intercepted by bandits in the hills near the Bloody Gate, leaving both realms short. Sansa reacted swiftly, dispatching a combined force of Northern and Vale knights to clear the area. The campaign was successful, cementing the idea that the two armies could coordinate smoothly under her leadership. The common soldiers began to speak of themselves as allies, almost like a single unified force. It was a subtle shift in identity, but a meaningful one. In time, as the snows began to show the first signs of receding, the realms stirred with hope for spring. Word reached Sansa that King Bran and his retinue planned a progress through the realm, aiming to see firsthand the condition of the people and possibly mend fractures left by war. They might visit the Trident, the Stormlands, even Dorne. The question remained whether they would venture as far as the Vale or the North. Sansa composed a letter inviting Bran to come, offering him the hospitality of both Winterfell and the Eyrie. While she did not relish the prospect of dancing around political niceties, she genuinely wished to see her brother, to look upon his face again and gauge his feelings about her dual rule. As she waited for a response, Sansa reflected on the changes in her life. She had come a long way from the frightened girl in King's Landing, who wrote poetry about handsome princes and gallant knights. She had weathered the cruelty of Joffrey, the manipulation of Littlefinger, the horrors inflicted by Ramsay Bolton. Each cruelty had shaped her, honing her will, teaching her how to navigate the labyrinth of power. Now, she was the architect of a new order, weaving together the North and the Vale, forging alliances that might stand for generations. She thought of her siblings, Jon, Arya, Bran, and wondered if they would recognize the person she had become. She thought of her parents, Eddard and Catelyn, and hoped that if they watched her from wherever the dead found peace, they would be proud. Spring approached in fits and starts. One day brought mild sunshine and a hint of thaw, the next a biting frost. Still, the worst of winter seemed to be behind them. Sansa capitalized on every improvement in the weather, ordering roads cleared, supplies moved, trade routes reopened. A sense of optimism sprouted, fragile but real. The small folk, weary of endless fighting and harsh winters, welcomed any chance at stability. Many, whether in the shadow of the Eyrie or the hills of the North, prayed for a lasting peace. It was during this transitional period that a letter arrived from King's Landing bearing the seal of the king. The language was formal, filled with the typical courtesies, but the gist was clear. King Bran planned to travel north, and he would indeed visit both Winterfell and the Eyrie, accompanied by a modest royal retinue. No armies, no grand host, just the king, his loyal guard, and some members of his small council. They wished to see Sansa's domain firsthand and discuss how best to integrate or at least harmonize their various interests. Some in the Eyrie were unsettled by this news, suspecting an attempt by the Iron Throne to bring the Vale fully under its banner. Others saw it as a promising sign that the crown might accept Sansa's rule. Sansa herself felt anticipation mingled with anxiety. She wanted to see Bran, yes, but what if his advisors pressed him to demand fealty she could not give? What if their illusions of a united realm clashed with her independence? She could not guess. She only knew that she must stand firm for what she believed best for her people. Yet she did not want to make an enemy of her own brother. Still, she had time to prepare. She arranged for her final tasks in the Vale, delegating to trusted knights and stewards, then made the journey to Winterfell so she could greet Bran properly on northern soil. The trip, though less treacherous now that spring made the passes more manageable, still carried a lonely edge. She rode in a group with Brienne and a handful of knights, quietly reflecting on how much her responsibilities had grown. At last, the familiar walls of Winterfell appeared, the banners snapping in the chilly wind. Sansa felt a surge of warmth at the sight. Here was where she had been born, where she had begun her journey. Now she returned not just as Lady of Winterfell, but as Lady of the Eyrie, forging a new destiny for House Stark. She saw to immediate matters, confirming that the granaries were stocked, that the great hall was prepared, that the guest chambers were readied for a royal visit. The northern lords arrived in small clusters to pay respects, and some told her of rumors swirling through the region. Tales of outlaws in the neck, growing tension with the Iron Islands, who were never fully content. Sansa listened, promised to act if needed, and guided them to remain vigilant. Then she awaited Bran's arrival. He came on a cool morning, his procession visible from the battlements. Sansa stood atop the walls alongside her household. She recognized the royal banner, the three-eyed raven motif that Bran had adopted upon his ascension, combined with the traditional crowned stag of Baratheon replaced by a newly designed image referencing the Targaryen wheel that had once turned. She also saw the Lannister lion in a small banner, signifying Tyrion's presence, and the banners of a few other houses. They entered Winterfell's courtyard in an orderly fashion. Bran was seated on a specially crafted wheeled chair, cloaked in fur, his expression serene. He looked older than she remembered, his face etched with an otherworldly calm that often unsettled those who did not know him. Tyrion Lannister rode behind him, dismounting gracefully. A few other figures followed, among them Ser Davos Seaworth, who had become the master of ships, and a handful of guards in shining armor. Sansa descended from the battlements, moving swiftly toward the courtyard. As soon as Bran's carriage halted, she curtsied with genuine respect. "Your Grace," she said softly, her voice carrying over the quiet of the courtyard. Bran inclined his head. "Sansa," he said simply. His voice had the same distant quality she recalled, as though he spoke from another place and time. Yet there was a warmth in his eyes, a flicker of the boy she had once known. Tyrion Lannister stepped forward, offering a slight bow. "Lady Sansa, my apologies, Lady of Winterfell and the Eyrie, I should say. It is a pleasure to see you again. You look well." She offered him a measured smile. "Lord Hand," she responded. "Welcome to Winterfell." Formalities aside, Sansa beckoned them inside. The courtyard bustled with stable hands and stewards taking charge of the royal mounts, while guards formed a perimeter. The visiting party entered the great hall, where a blazing fire banished the northern chill. Once seated, they exchanged pleasantries, but Sansa knew that much lay unsaid, swirling beneath the surface. At the earliest private opportunity, she spoke quietly to Bran. "You're well?" she asked, studying his face. "You've come a long way." He tilted his head, those deep eyes of his focusing on her. "I am as I must be," he replied cryptically. "I see you have accomplished much since we last spoke." She managed a small smile. "We all must do what we can. Times have changed. The realm is fragile. I have tried to keep the North and the Vale safe." Bran nodded. "And you've succeeded from what I have heard. But our presence here suggests that some in King's Landing worry the realm is too divided. They whisper about your power." She caught the unspoken question. "I have no designs on the Iron Throne, if that is the fear," she said calmly. "I only want peace and security for my people." He gazed at her, searching her features. "Yes," he murmured after a moment. "I believe you." Tyrion approached, noticing their conversation. "1,000 pardons for the interruption," he said, inclining his head. "But might we speak in a more private setting, Lady Sansa? The king and I would like to discuss the details of your arrangement with the Vale." Sansa gestured toward the side door. "Of course, we can use my solar." Bran signaled for Davos and a few others to remain behind. Then, with Tyrion guiding his wheeled chair, they followed Sansa to a modestly sized chamber with a table and a low-burning fireplace. Brienne, ever vigilant, trailed at a respectful distance. Once inside, Sansa closed the door, and they arranged themselves around the table. She offered them mulled wine, which Tyrion accepted gratefully, while Bran declined. Tyrion took a sip, letting its warmth wash over him, before diving into the matter at hand. "We understand that you have effectively united the North and the Vale under your leadership," he said in a measured tone. Some in King's Landing worry that you might be attempting to form a separate kingdom, or to challenge the authority of the crown. I personally have argued that is not your aim, based on my knowledge of you. But I must hear your intentions clearly. Sansa inclined her head, showing no defensiveness. I respect King Bran's position, she said softly, glancing at her brother. I have no wish to undermine him. However, the North declared independence for a reason. We have endured enough outside rule, enough meddling from the South. The Vale, meanwhile, chose me as their lady because of my blood ties and their desire for stable leadership. I have not forced them into any rebellion against the crown. They are free to pledge fealty to you, your grace, if they wish. Bran listened quietly, then spoke in that calm, distant voice. But do they wish to? Sansa paused. Many in the Vale were always loyal to the Iron Throne in name, but they have come to see me as their direct ruler. If you demand their fealty as king, you would need to negotiate with the Vale Lords. As for me, I consider the Vale and the North to be aligned primarily under my leadership. If we can reach an accommodation that maintains our autonomy while acknowledging the crown's broader authority, then we can preserve peace. Tyrion nodded, swirling his wine. A vassal relationship of sorts, but looser than a typical arrangement? Perhaps an alliance akin to what Dorne once had, separate but recognized. That might satisfy both sides. Bran's eyes seemed to look beyond the walls. There have been many precedents, he said. The Targaryens once allowed some regions a measure of autonomy. Dorne itself was not fully conquered until a marriage alliance was arranged. The political landscape can shift, but the realm is tired of war. Sansa suppressed a flicker of relief. Exactly. War helps no one. My only goal is to secure the North and the Vale. Let us formalize a mutual understanding. We will not raise arms against the crown, and the crown will not impose direct rule here. Tyrion shrugged. It seems a reasonable arrangement, but it is not all that must be discussed. There are rumors that you are training a joint Northern Vale army. Do you intend to maintain a standing force? That might provoke concerns in King's Landing. Sansa kept her face composed. We must defend ourselves from threats, be they from Ironborn raiders, wildling marauders beyond the wall, or bandits in the mountains of the moon. Given the havoc we've all endured, it is prudent to have trained soldiers. I will not apologize for ensuring my people's safety. Bran looked at her with understanding. You do not need to. He turned to Tyrion. Let the realm see that it is a wise precaution. We need not force every region to rely on the crown for defense. Decentralizing might be best, as long as no armies threaten each other. Tyrion exhaled, setting his wine aside. Very well. I believe we can craft a new charter for the relationship between the North, the Vale, and the crown. An arrangement based on mutual respect, shared goals, and no forced subjugation. If the Vale's lords desire it, they can remain nominally part of the Seven Kingdoms, but in practice they'd largely govern themselves under your leadership. The king's main request would be loyalty in times of foreign threat, should such arise. Sansa inclined her head again. That is acceptable. They spent the next hour ironing out details, discussing trade tariffs, boundaries, the presence of crown officials in the North or the Vale, and other nuances of governance. At times, old tensions flared, reminders of the blood spilled and the grudges held. But Sansa remained poised, advocating firmly for her people's autonomy. Tyrion, as Hand, proved pragmatic, seeking common ground rather than absolute control. Meanwhile, Bran's near-omniscient composure guided the conversation toward peaceful resolution, as though he had already glimpsed the outcome in his visions. By the meeting's end, they reached a framework that could serve as the basis of a treaty. In essence, the crown recognized Sansa Stark as the Lady of the North and the Eyrie, with full authority to govern both realms as she saw fit. The Vale's lords would decide, region by region, how closely they adhered to the crown's laws, but in any matters of conflict beyond their borders, they would coordinate with King's Landing. The North's independence was reaffirmed, though it pledged not to expand militarily southward or harbor enemies of the crown. In return, the crown promised not to interfere in the internal affairs of the North or the Vale, respecting their customs and leadership. A tenuous balance, but one Sansa believed could hold if nurtured with care. In the days that followed, Bran toured Winterfell, reacquainting himself with the old halls and corridors of his childhood. He spoke little, but Sansa sensed a faint sadness in his eyes, a recognition that things would never be as they were. They were all changed. Too many losses, too many lessons. Tyrion, for his part, seemed eager to finalize agreements, drafting official documents for ratification by the Vale's lords and the northern houses. Sansa signed them with measured relief, aware that a new chapter of Westeros's history was being written. When the time came for Bran's retinue to depart, Sansa accompanied him to the courtyard. Snow still lingered, but a hint of green poked through in patches. Before mounting his carriage, Bran gazed at her with that deep, unfathomable stare. "You have done well, Sansa," he said simply. "Continue to do so." She bowed her head. "I will. Take care, Bran." He gave a slight nod, then Tyrion stepped forward and offered her a small, wry smile. "Until next we meet, Lady Stark. May we not find ourselves on opposite sides of a battlefield." She returned the ghost of a grin. "I hope not, Lord Hand." With that, the royal party passed through Winterfell's gates, leaving Sansa standing in the courtyard. She watched them recede down the King's Road until they vanished from sight. A soft exhale escaped her lips. The tension that had hovered around her heart for days eased. She had navigated a crucial test. King Bran had come, recognized her authority, and left peacefully. The realm could breathe easier, at least for now. The seasons edged closer to spring. As the snows melted and rivers ran swift, trade lines reopened, caravans ventured north with goods, and the seeds of prosperity began to sprout. Sansa fulfilled her promise to the Vale, dispatching seeds, tools, and skilled workers to help them bolster their harvest. The Vale, in turn, sent horses, falcons, and other resources that thrived in the mountainous region, strengthening ties of commerce and culture. Traveling minstrels carried tales of the Lady of Winterfell and the Eyrie, a woman shaped by tragedy and cunning, now guiding two great regions into an era of unity. Over time, Sansa found her domain, what some called her empire, functioning with surprising harmony. The northern lords, once suspicious of any perceived southern entanglements, appreciated the mutual defense pacts and increased trade revenues. The Vale lords, initially wary of a northern ruler, discovered that Sansa's even-handed governance and respect for their customs far surpassed the manipulative unpredictability of Petyr Baelish or the absent-minded rule of Robin Arryn. Though she maintained separate councils in Winterfell and the Eyrie, she made sure each realm's priorities were addressed, fostering a sense of shared identity while preserving local autonomy. In that balance, she realized, lay the secret, an empire born of mutual interest, not conquest, a tapestry of alliances, not a patchwork of forced allegiances. She recalled the old stories of the Targaryen conquest, how the dragons had burned and hammered the continent into submission. That was not her way. She had no dragons, no thirst for unrestrained power. What she held was the trust of her people, earned through trials and tempered by empathy. One crisp morning, as she stood on the battlements of the Eyrie, gazing at the rolling fog beneath the castle's perch, she felt a strange sense of wonder at what her life had become. The wind ruffled her hair, carrying the scent of pine and distant snows. The sun caught the high peaks, illuminating the world in gold. Behind her, guards in northern cloaks stood side by side with Vale knights, both sets of sigils proudly displayed. This was her achievement, a union unthinkable in earlier years. She closed her eyes and remembered the frightened girl who once clung to fairy tales. She remembered the cruelty of Joffrey's court, the horrors inflicted by Ramsay, the silver-tongued manipulations of Littlefinger. She recalled the heartbreak of losing her parents and brothers, the anguish of war. Through it all, she had learned. She had grown. She had discovered that power did not have to mean cruelty, that politics could serve the greater good if wielded with wisdom. She had forged alliances not through fear, but through reason and respect. And so the North and the Vale rose together, forging a new beacon of stability in a realm still scarred by conflict. A soft footstep drew her from her reverie. She turned to see Brienne, ever vigilant, standing quietly a few paces behind. The tall knight bowed her head slightly. "My lady," she said, "pardon the interruption, but you asked to be informed when Lord Royce arrived." Sansa nodded. "Yes, of course. Thank you, Sir Brienne." She cast one last look at the breathtaking vista below, then turned to head inside. Lord Royce would be waiting in the great hall, no doubt eager to speak about the next steps in forging an even stronger alliance between the Vale and the North. There were always more matters to settle. Tax agreements, judicial disputes, the slow reconstruction of ravaged holdfasts. Perhaps they would also discuss a formal ceremony to symbolize the union of the two regions. As she strode through the halls, her fur-trimmed cloak trailing behind her, she felt both the weight and the privilege of her position. Each footstep echoed in the marble corridors of the Eyrie, the castle she had once feared but now commanded. She was Sansa Stark, Lady of Winterfell, Lady of the Eyrie, and in every sense that mattered, the architect of a Northern Vale alliance unlike any Westeros had seen. The land was still fraught with challenges, but she faced them not as a powerless pawn but as a leader determined to shape her people's destiny. And so she walked forward, step by confident step, prepared to meet the duties of the day and all the days that followed, guided by the steadfast knowledge that she had risen above the tragedies of her youth. She had claimed her birthright, not through force of arms or marriage ties, but through her own resilience, her earned respect, and a deep, abiding commitment to the welfare of those under her care. In that moment, she knew that whatever trials came, she would meet them, and the realm she guarded would endure.